Welcome to No Extra Words, One Person Search for Story. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. If I may, I'd like to begin this episode with a story. One afternoon, day before Thanksgiving, poet Marilyn Nelson accepted her editor's invitation to come to New York City from her home in Connecticut to discuss a book project. Her editor told her at that meeting that she, the editor, thought Nelson was the perfect person to write the book that editor had wanted to release her entire career. A children's book about lynching. By this point in her career, Nelson was an established poet. She published her first poetry book in 1978, and she was working as a professor of English at the University of Connecticut, a position which she still holds, although she now is a professor emeritus. But she was new to writing for children and young adults. She had done a few translations and collaborations, but she had not thought seriously about writing for children until she had a chance meeting with an editor at Front Street Books. She told him she was working on a biography of George Washington Carver, but it was for adults. He invited her to send it anyway, and it was published with Front Street in 2001 as Carver, A Life in Poems. Now, one of the things I am learning as I delve into these books deeper than I usually do on this podcast is that editors, while so important to how literature comes to us, remain pretty nameless. I looked everywhere that I could think of for the name of this editor who, after reading Carver, brought Marilyn Nelson to her office, and for the life of me, I couldn't find who this woman is. But one of the poems in Carver made this editor think Marilyn Nelson was the perfect person to write this book on lynching. Carver is a gorgeous book. Poems take us from Carver's birth as a slave in 1864. Now, he was stolen. As an infant child, he was stolen. He was a piece of property that was stolen. Think about that for a minute. So each poem presents us with a moment in time, a certain perspective. Sometimes it's his, sometimes it's someone else's. And there's usually a small note or photo on the bottom placing the poem at a time in his life. It's the first biography in poetry form that I had ever read. Marilyn Nelson, who would eventually turn at least one other book she was writing for adults into a project for kids, described the publication as Carver as changing everything for her. Now, she was not a new writer at this time. In 2001, when Carver came out, she had already won the National Book Award once and been nominated for a second. But this first book for children changed the direction of her career. The Perceiving Self, which is the poem on lynching that brought her to the attention of this editor in this moment that we're talking about right now, is haunting. It's metaphorical, it's beautiful. As poetry is, it's not explicit, and yet it conveys everything it needs to. The words both bring us into that moment and shield us from it. Later, Marilyn Nelson would recall the meeting with her editor where they talked about the book on lynching. And she said two things came immediately to her mind. The first is this woman is nuts. How could you possibly create a book on a subject like lynching for children? And the second was she remembered immediately the story of Emmett Till. A bit of history, something I at least didn't know before I read this book. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy in 1955 when his mother sent him from his home in Chicago to visit relatives in Mississippi. His mother would later recall that she had warned him how to behave in Mississippi, intentionally trying to keep him safe. The story is that while he was there, a white lady accused him of whistling at her in a store. He spoke with a stutter, and whistling was a coping mechanism he used to help when he was stuck on a word. It may have been that, it may have been nothing, no one's really sure. But the woman's husband and his brother dragged Emmett out of his uncle's house, beat him, murdered him, and dumped his body in the river. They were acquitted in court, and the next year confessed to the whole thing in an interview. Eventually, 3 other men were implicated in the case. No one ever was convicted or served time. Marilyn Nelson, the poet, who was 9 years old in 1955, remembered that story. Till's mother, Mamie, insisted on an open casket because she wanted people to see what had been done to her son, and that funeral, that open casket, and that murder made headlines across the country and really galvanized the civil rights movement. And at the same time as Marilyn Nelson is fighting the idea of writing this book, she's got the story of Emmett Till in her mind. A boy the age the kids who would read this book It was incredibly painful to think about writing it. She would later say, quote, "You just don't want to open your mind to something like that," unquote. But she did write a wreath for Emmett Till, which was published by Houghton Mifflin in 2005. Nothing I could say to you could possibly describe this book. It's impossible. It's recommended for grades 9+, and in my opinion, it should be required reading in every high school in America. There is so much to it, and yet it takes me back to Carver because the blank space is almost as important as the words. There is what is said, and there is what is not said. I don't think any medium conveys the unsaid better than poetry does. So as Marilyn Nelson was figuring out how to write this book, she recalled a form of poetry she'd only seen once. It's the heroic crown of sonnets. It's an incredibly rare form of poetry because it's really hard to do. So basically what it is, it's 14 interlinked sonnets. So the last line of each sonnet becomes the first line of the next sonnet. And then there's a 15th, which consists of the first lines from the first 14. I can't overstate how difficult that is to do. So writing a sonnet is complicated by itself. A sonnet has to be 14 lines long. It's an iambic pentameter. It has a certain rhyme scheme to it. There's usually a twist in the middle plot-wise. It's just a really hard form to write in. So you do that, which is already hard. You have to do 14 that are connected together. So you're using that last line becomes first line thing. And then when you put all 14 of those first lines together, they have to make sense. I can't describe to you the kind of wordsmith we are in the hands of here. But for Marilyn Nelson, the strict form was not just a stylistic decision, it was self-defense. The topic was so emotional, so brutal, so impossible to write that if she just lets herself go, it's hard to do. If you put strict limits on the form, it's a way of kind of taking her own emotions out of the process. She would talk about it later as giving control to the muse. And she described writing this book with her heart in her mouth. So that's what you got going on in this book. You have the poetry, you have the strict format. This is a picture book. It's not a picture book for young children, but it's a picture book. So you have the art. I don't have words to describe the art to you in this medium, but when you do pick up this book, make sure you read the artist notes at the end because the art also fits in. And over that, you have this topic that simultaneously cannot and has to be told. Lynching. Because it's impossible to talk about. It's a horrific thing, but if we don't talk about it, then we run the risk of it happening again because people don't know what's possible. So that's what's going on in this book. In 2003, so in the middle of all this emotion, she's writing this book. In 2003, Marilyn Nelson is working on the third sonnet in the book, and Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, died. Marilyn Nelson would say later that after Mamie died, she could remember asking this dead mother for help writing this book. It's more than Emmett's story she was telling. It's really hard to read. But it's also not hard to read. It's also gorgeous. It's not easy for me to sit here and recommend that anyone read a book on lynching. It's not pleasant. It's not happy. It's not a fun thing to talk about, to remember, to tell. But there is something so special about this book. It's not all blood and guts and gore. It's not all the end of Emmett's story. It really pays homage to this person who, if he lived, my dad turned 78 this week. If Emmett Till had lived, he would turn 77 this year. He died at 14. And it's 14-year-olds this book is written for, and I think it does a really nice job of, this isn't just a victim. This isn't just an incident. This is a person. This is a human, and so is his mother. Reading A Wreath for Emmett Till made me want to know more and more about Marilyn Nelson and read more of her work. A Wreath to Emmett Till is what brought me to Carver, A Life in Poems. She is a fascinating person. She has a memoir in poetry. So not only did she write the first biography in poetry I'd ever read, but the first memoir in poetry. It's called How I Discovered Poetry, and it probably raises more questions than it answers. It is also in sonnet form. It's 50 sonnets that cover the 1950s and speak in the voice of young Marilyn. So in 1950, she's 4, and in 1959, she's 14. It's a beautiful portrait of a developing poet. It's set against this backdrop of Black history and civil rights history in the 1950s, and Marilyn traveling around the country with her family in this military life she was living. Her father was a Tuskegee Airman, and he became an Air Force officer and served all over the country after the integration of the military. And it really captures the 1950s and her childhood. I think it's very easy to think of the civil rights movement as being a 1960s phenomenon, but there's so much going on in the 50s. You've got Brown versus the Board of Education. You've got Little Rock. Emmett Till plays a central role because he's right in the middle of that decade, and he definitely pops up in How I Discovered Poetry. There's a lot going on there. It's not a complete autobiography. It doesn't answer all the questions I had about Marilyn Nelson. Definitely gives insight into the formation of the poet, but I would love to talk to her. I just want to know more. Here's what I do know. Marilyn Nelson is the former poet laureate of Connecticut. She's the founder of Soul Mountain Writers Retreat, which serves mainly writers from underrepresented groups. She's a 3-time National Book Award nominee, so not only did she win one and get nominated for one before writing Carver, but she also got nominated for a 3rd one for Carver. And I love the connections. We are 7 episodes into season 2, and I'm enjoying the through lines of how these writers connect with one another. Because one of the things that I discovered is Marilyn Nelson is currently poet in residence at St. John the Divine in New York City. If that rings any bells, you have to go back 1 episode to Madeline L'Engle, who served 40 years as a librarian there in what is now the Madeline L'Engle Library. It's my new goal in life to someday be a librarian at St. John the Divine, which is one of my favorite sacred spaces in all of North America. My husband was very quick to point out to me how completely impractical that goal is. So I talked a little bit earlier about Marilyn Nelson's switch to writing more for children and young adults. But one of the things that she strongly believes in is that children and young adults should not just read poetry for children, but they should read classic poets, Dickinson, Hughes. She has one poem in How I Discovered Poetry where she talks about some of the names that she came across as a child of, I think, 13. Gwendolyn Brooks, and so on and so on. I could not agree more. You're going to get a little bit of my take on how we teach poetry to children and adults when we get to Poetry Month, which is coming in April. Stay tuned. But I think that's one of the things that makes her a brilliant poet for children and young adults, is she writes not at them, but for them, in a way that respects their intellect and their range of emotion. That's what makes her books so powerful, and that's what makes them accessible to so many ages. I was really having trouble deciding who would I recommend How I Discovered Poetry for. You know, is it for sort of 9 and 10-year-olds that are her age group when she's telling the story? Is it more of a YA thing? Would I give it to adults? And the answer is yes, yes, and yes. And it all started because one day she had a conversation with an editor who said, "Send me some of your work." And she said, "I don't write for children." And he said, "Send it anyway." And it became George Washington Carver, A Life in Poems. It is pretty cool to reflect on how books come to be. And that, of course, brings me to the second book, because these are pairings on today's episode, which is Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison. This is one of the few books I read in 2017. I am not good at this moment in my life at keeping up with everything that's being published, and so I'm feeling about 4 years behind in what's coming out in children's books, but I'm glad I made this one part of my 2017 reading. So there's a joke among us literary folks who hang out on social media that in October, your Instagram is filled with these gorgeous pictures from illustrator friends who are participating in #Inktober. And then in November, all you get is posts from writer friends who are participating in NaNoWriMo, and they just want to die. But there is a community of writers on social media, and it is a way that writers nourish their craft. And Vashti Harrison's book did come directly from social media. As an aspiring illustrator, she created an Instagram account to share her work. And during Black History Month, she shared each day a different Black woman from history in illustration and bio. That became a huge success, and that became Little Leaders. This book is one of those biographies of many biography compilations. It's organized chronologically by birth year, so it goes from Phyllis Wheatley to Dominic Dawes. Each 2-page spread covers a woman from history with an illustration and short bio. And what I love is, At the top of each page, below the woman's name, so you have her name and her birth and death years, and then job titles. So you know exactly, whether you know her or not, you know exactly before you start reading what it is that she became famous for. So, for example, you have Alma Woodsey Thomas, 1891 to 1978, teacher, artist. Or Oprah Winfrey, 1954 broadcast journalist, media mogul. There are 42 women in all. Child Ruby Bridges, all the way up to pilot Bessie Coleman and beyond. The illustrations are all in very much the same style. The women all have their eyes closed, and you either see a frontal view or a side view. Harrison spoke in her introduction about how she really wanted these women to be interchangeable because she wanted young readers to be able to see themselves in every single one of them. There is a back section that has kind of bonus little leaders. So there's an extra 12 back there that just very little pictures and very quick reads about them. And then there's some back matter as well with some source notes and good websites and things like that. So has all those things you want from nonfiction. One of the things this book made me miss is being in a school library setting. Because as soon as I saw it, I could instantly picture it on a library table with 6 kids around it, reading it together and picking out their favorites. It would work really well there. But it works really well in other settings too. I mean, you know, you could definitely hand it to a child for solo reading. Makes a good read aloud. I hope every school library in America has a copy. In her introduction, Harrison talks about she's really writing for her younger self and why representation and being able to see oneself matters. But she also wanted to be sure to point out that this book is not just for Black girls, and that she hopes any reader can see themselves in the women in this book. And that sums up why it's important to me to bring you this book and its partner, A Wreath for Emmett Till. When I started this season, I started by making a list of books that had been meaningful for me in my life that I wanted to share. And I started making some notes and kind of piecing together how I wanted to talk about them. And one of the columns on my kind of spreadsheet that was really just for me was about voice, because I wanted to know, were the books that I was choosing representing a diversity of voices in terms of male and female, LGBTQ, people of color, in both who is being written about and who is doing the writing. I really wanted a broad list. That was important to me because representation is important to me. I can only be what I am. I'm a white lady who talks about books, and I work in an overwhelmingly white and female profession. So I am in the majority in my workspace pretty much every place that I've been. But I don't think that talking about books by people of color is just the responsibility of librarians of color. I think inclusion is important. And I think who we highlight and who we talk about is important. And while I can't be anybody other than who I am, I certainly have a choice in what I read and what I share. I think we have this tendency in media consumption to think about materials created by and about the voices of the majority to be for everyone, whereas media from underrepresented groups is for that audience, which is ridiculous. But I see it all the time. I think it's definitely true in podcasting. You know, it's a mistake I've made myself and corrected, where I've seen a show and it didn't feel for me, and then I realized I was being dumb. And I think we do it. I know we do it in literature. I've seen it. You know, why is there an LGBTQ section in your bookstore? Why is there a women's section in your bookstore? The implication that things that are written by these folks are written for just them. I read an article a while back, and I wish I still had it, because I don't have the citation on it. I wish I could share it with you. I was just flipping through a journal at work. But it was a YA author who's a Black woman, and she was talking about how as a child she loved From the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basley, Frank Weiler. That's a classic by E.L. Konigsberg. If you don't know this book, it's a mystery. It's 2 kids, a brother and a sister, who run away from home and decide that they, instead of living on the street as runaways, they want to live at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It's a wonderful book. And this author described reading it and loving it as a child, and not spending a whole lot of time thinking about how these white, upper middle class kids were super different from her. She just got sucked in and enjoyed the story. And so now, as an author, she's perplexed by why editors, agents, librarians, whoever it is doing the sharing, tell her how difficult it is for kids to relate to her rural, immigrant, dark-skinned characters. Why? I mean, why is that so difficult to ask kids to find and relate to other people? Good literature does this. Good literature shows you humanity in all of its forms and the ways that you can relate to all kinds of people. And good literature does not just include fiction, it includes nonfiction as well. Whether it's the inspiring leaders of Vashti Harrison or the painful story of Emmett Till that absolutely must be told, these aren't people that just some kids should read about and know about, just the kids that look like them. I couldn't get little leaders at the library to talk about it for this show because there's a waiting list for it because this is an incredibly popular book, as it should be. So I went to my local indie bookstore and bought one and went to look for it to make this recording and found it in my now almost 4-year-old's room. My blonde-haired, blue-eyed little boy was loving this book, sitting in a chair looking at these really beautiful illustrations of these women, and I got to pull them into my lap and tell him their stories and share their history. It is most certainly true that books are a universal language, but it's only universal if we let everybody in. It's only universal if we make sure all points of view and all perspectives are being shared with all kinds of people. We should all read books, listen to podcasts, watch movies about people who don't look like us. And I would say it's more important for those of us who could choose not to, if we wanted to do so. I hope you enjoyed this book pairing. If you did, please share it with a friend. Your recommendations are the way that we get this out to more people, and every one of them is very much appreciated. If you want more book pairings, you can subscribe to the show. Jeez, we're everywhere. We're in Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I am always looking for new friends over at goodreads.com/noextrawords, and that's a great place to see not just what I'm reading, but also what I'm putting in there to work on for future episodes. I am also at No Extra Words on Twitter and Instagram, although I will not for 1 second suggest my Instagram is half as good as Vashti Harrison's, who you should go follow right now. Next week will be the opening week of baseball season, which is always something we celebrate here on No Extra Words and here in the Dersh House. And so I'm giving you a 3-for-2 pairing. I'm pairing up 3 books. Can you even do that? I don't know. We're gonna. Literature about baseball has been dominated by men, but I didn't want to go there. I wanted to bring you women's voices that have written on baseball. As always, reading along is never required. If you just want to come hear me talk about how baseball is conveyed through the voices of women, I hope you will. If you'd like to read, feel free to pick one, none, or all. But what we're going to talk about is the novel Squeeze Play by Jane Levy, our first adult fiction book covering on this show. That's exciting. The memoir Wait Till Next Year by Doris Kearns Goodwin, and the picture book biography She Loved Baseball about Hall of Famer Effa Manley, and that's written by Audrey Vernick. I am going to focus on those 3, but none of those 3 covers women who actually play ball, so I'd be willing to bet we're also going to take a look at Girl Wonder, a baseball story in 9 innings by Deborah Hopkinson, and that is a picture book. So you may even get a 4 for 1. Ambitious, no? I hope you'll join us for that. Whether you're a fan of baseball or not, we're always a fan of good books here on the show. For show notes and how to reach us with feedback, which we always love to hear, please visit us at noextrawords.wordpress.com. And until I see you again, I hope you out there find yourselves some good stories.